Let's turn our attention to practice and Christian practice in the latter Middle Ages. I'm going to start with the issue of the Eucharist. By the 800s, there was an increased development or increased discussion about how the bread is Jesus' body and how the cup is his blood. Now, Christians have been celebrating the Eucharist, communion, Lord's Supper for centuries. But there is this question, this debate over when Jesus says, "This is my body, this is my blood," what does he mean? Now, if you come from Churches of Christ or another Protestant group, you probably take that metaphorically, right? Symbolically, that the bread symbolizes. I frequently hear this in right before the Lord's Supper. Right? It symbolizes the body. It symbolizes the blood. And so we're probably used to a notion of symbolism or memorial. But some people started to think in the later Middle Ages that maybe there is a real presence of the body and blood. Now, part of this has to do with a gradual transformation that is taking place over thinking about the Eucharist and seeing the Eucharist not as a meal of remembrance, but as a sacrifice. And so you have more of this notion of sacrifice, the piece of furniture that the Eucharist is on being an altar, and so that sacrificial notion of Christ's death. And so more and more people began to understand the is of "this is my body" to be a real presence. Right? That when Jesus says, "This is my body," that it really is his body, and would appeal to John chapter 6, where Jesus says, my body is truly food, my blood is truly drink, and unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you will not have life in you. And so they point to passages like that and are taking them in very literal sense. One of the first people, at least those that we know of, that really talks about this is a man named Pacius Radbertus. In the year 834, he writes a treatise called "On the Body and Blood of the Lord." Essentially, Radbertus claims that in the prayers offered before the Eucharist, the elements are transformed. And so the bread actually becomes the body, the cup actually becomes the blood in the prayer. But this transformation is not sent through the human senses for Radbertus. Right? You don't see the bread suddenly becoming flesh, the wine suddenly becoming blood. You do not taste flesh, you do not taste blood. And so in appearance, and through our sensory perceptions, it still appears to be bread and wine, but in reality, for Radbertus, it becomes the body and blood. And so when we feast on the Eucharist, we feast on the actual body and blood of Jesus. Now, people that kind of follow this position become known as realists because they believe in the real presence of Christ. Now, there have been some hints of a realist position before Radbertus, but very unsubstantial, not too clear. This is kind of the first substantial presentation of the bread becoming the body and the wine becoming the blood. But not everybody agreed with this. Not everybody thought that this was convincing, and some people actually thought that it was heretical. And so King Charles the Bald, Dr. B the Bald, no, I don't like it. King Charles the Bald asks a man named Ratramnus to respond 2, on the body and blood of the Lord. And his approach was to say, yes, Jesus is present in communion, in the Eucharist, but it is spiritually present, not physically. That in the observance of the Eucharist, the body or the bread stays bread, the wine stays wine. Yes, Jesus is present, but not in the actual elements. In this debate between the realists and we might call it the symbolic group, both of them are pulling passages from those early Christians, people like Justin and Irenaeus and some other people. Ambrose, one of those early, Ambrose of Milan, he, in his discussion, simply said it is the body. Okay, but again, what does is mean? Is a symbolic way, like when Jesus says, I am the door, we don't think he's like this tall made of wood. We think it's symbolically, right? Augustine, he didn't really discuss this that much, and so he's unclear, but there's all these attempts to try and appeal to the early Christians and say, these early Christians viewed it this way. Into this mix between the realist and the symbolist is Rabanus Maurus, an abbot, kind of a leader in a monastery in the city of Fulda, which is in modern-day Germany. He tries to take a middle of the road, right? Try to find some sort of compromise. And so he says, well, we can't say that the bread is the historical body of Jesus. But when the person takes the Eucharist, the bread becomes the true body created again by God's power. So he wants to say, well, it's not the historical body of Jesus, but the real body of Jesus is there in the bread, and the real blood is there in the wine, and God has recreated it again. And so this debate goes between these theologians for several centuries. In the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, the realist view is taken. And this is the position that remains within Catholicism to this day. This is the position, and I forgot to put this on the slide, so best guess on spelling it. Transubstantiation. 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 So that is the official teaching of the Catholic Church to today. The elements still appear to be bread and wine, but are really the body and blood. And of course, there are some people who have claimed to have experiences throughout history that kind of are used to support this, right? So people saying that they've seen the host, what Catholics call the bread, bleeding. Right? And so there are all these kind of mystical experiences that people have said that have been marshaled to say, well, it actually transforms into the body and blood. Aquinas will be helpful in kind of supplying the theological languages for this. And essentially, he makes the case that there's a difference between what he refers to as the substance and the accident. Now, what he means by accident is the outside appearance. And so the outside appearance, it is still bread and wine. So the accidents appear to be bread and wine. But the substance is what is the real quality. Right? It becomes really bread, it becomes really blood. But we can only perceive this through the eyes of faith. Right? Nothing in, and so if you would do some sort of scientific test on it, it would still appear to be bread and wine. But in reality, because we're using our senses, in reality, through the eyes of faith, we understand it becomes the body and the blood. Questions about this transformation, in understanding transformation? Another prominent practice developing in the later Middle Ages is what's known as mysticism. Now, we talked about scholasticism, and scholasticism was an approach to try and use rationality as an expression of your commitment to Christianity. Others turned to emotional and spiritual experiences for their connection to God. Now, this trend of looking for an experiential religion had been a part of Christianity. Gregory of Nyssa, back to Cappadocians, back in the 4th century, talked about this idea of uniting with God, right? Your soul uniting with God. But it's really the Middle Ages where mysticism really takes off. And the idea behind mysticism is this attempt to find avenues to experience God in a very personal way. So not just through the words, not just through the intellect, but how do I experience God personally? And so people would talk about desiring to experience a spiritual union with God, of losing yourself in the immenseness of God, which is quite different than approaching a text. And so this idea of what you need to do to accomplish this is some sort of internal experience. You have to spend your time contemplating and meditating to achieve this union. And these unions are believed to be God's expressions of God's grace. And so these are only given to some. One of the most famous mystics of the Middle Ages is a man named Bernard of Clairvaux. He lived during the 12th century, and during the 12th century there was a lot of Christian mysticism. And a lot of those mystics often had sway and influence over leadership, and bishops and priests. Bernard created the rule of the Knights Templar. Right? He's the one that kind of sets out what they're supposed to do and what they're supposed to follow. He was an advisor to kings and other rulers, and was even an advisor to 4 popes. Ultimately, Bernard emphasized that we need to completely surrender our will to the will of God. That is how we achieve union with Christ, union with God. A lot of the things that Bernard focused on were related to the death or the passion of Christ. And so if you hear that term passion in this context, it's related to Jesus' death. And so a lot of his contemplation, a lot of the things that he focused on was Jesus' death. And that's probably part of the reason why the song, or the hymn, O Sacred Head, is often attributed to Bernard of Clairvaux. It's a little unclear as to whether he actually was the author of that hymn or not. God is known, says Bernard, so far as he is loved. And so that you need to have that emotional connection to God to really know God. You can't just study text in order to understand God. Now, largely, Bernard focused on contemplation, meditation. Other individuals tended to experience visions. Hildegard of Bingen was an example of this type of mysticism. And she recorded 26 visions that she had of God, of Christ, throughout her life. She too wielded a lot of authority because of her mystical experiences, corresponded with kings, interacted with other religious leaders. Ultimately, ultimately, Hildegard felt that the decline in society that was being experienced during the Middle Ages was due to the weakness of men. And she said women had to act where men had failed. And what this shows us about mysticism is that mysticism provided an avenue for women to exercise authority. Right? Because women can't be priests, women can't be bishops, women can't be the Pope. Although there is this supposed Pope Jane or June or whatever that some people suggest was actually Pope, but she was female. So women don't have access to authority, and mysticism allowed women to exert that authority through their visions, through their advice to kings and popes. And we'll see that when we come back to mysticism in the Renaissance, as we see especially two examples, Catherine of Siena and Teresa of Avila, who were very powerful because of their mystical visions. Church architecture began to develop as well in the later Middle Ages. And so in the West, especially, you begin to see new styles of church buildings. There are essentially two major styles. One from the 6th to 10th, or from the 10th to 12th century, one that becomes more prominent from the 12th on. First is the Romanesque style of church buildings. This is developed out of the basilicas. The floor plan of the Romanesque architecture was more of a traditional cross than the T-shape of the basilicas. Many of the roofs were stone that were supported with barrel vaults of arches. And this is an example of Romanesque style. Right? So the stone roofs, there are arches throughout the building to try and support that stone. Also, many of these buildings had to be were structured with very thick walls, right, to support a stone roof. Were supported by what were known as buttresses, and these are these supports on the outside, because of the weight of the roof, which meant there were very few windows in these Romanesque styles. Inside, the walls and the ceilings might be covered with gold. There might be tapestries, pictures, other types of art. They might also include life-size sculptures. Right? So there's, again, this kind of development not only in architectural style, but artwork and aesthetics within the building itself. And so the arches is very important in the Romanesque style in order to support all that weight. Another example of Romanesque with some windows, but of course very, very thin because of just the architectural weaknesses. By the middle of the 12th century, the Gothic style becomes more prominent. The floor plan was basically similar, that cross that we normally think of as opposed to a T-shape. But some things have taken place in the shape, particularly the roofs. You have more vaulted roofs instead of arches. This is Notre Dame in Paris, an example of Gothic style. Because of that, it shifted the weight some, but you still needed buttresses in order to help stabilize those walls. Particularly, you have the development of what are known as flying buttresses, right? Where there's this space here between the wall and the support of the wall. A lot of towers and spires in the Gothic wall, the church buildings reaching up to heaven. Also in the Gothic style, because of the shift in weight, there were more windows that would be able to be included in that, which allowed for the creation, additionally, of stained glass. And so the great stained glass windows that would often feature biblical scenes, eventually prominent saints as well. You also have an increase in numbers of buildings known as cathedrals. A cathedral was a church presided over by a bishop. Right? So bishops were in charge of a region, but they would usually be located in one specific church. That was like their home church. And so it was known as a cathedral because the cathedra, or the seat or throne of the bishop, was present there. And so you have these cathedrals. And those increase. The number of churches in general, church buildings, increase as well during this time. Also developing in practice of Christianity is the use of drama. A couple of different types of drama during this time. First was the development of the mystery plays. Mystery plays were dramatizations of stories from the Bible. Right? So you took a story from the Bible and you acted it out. Another type was the morality play. The morality play was essentially, it wasn't a story from the Bible per se, but virtues and vices would be personified. So you would have an actor playing sloth, right? And an actress playing, well, probably not an actress, an actor playing honor. And so you take these virtues and you personify them, and in a drama, encourage people to be honorable instead of slothful. Finally, there were the miracle plays. Miracle plays were focused on the lives of saints. We'll talk about saints probably on a Thursday. We'll have to pick up on some of that. But these are non-biblical or post-biblical individuals. Right? And so the idea is that you should emulate their lives, and so the plays encourage why you should emulate them, but they weren't specifically stories from the Bible.
What's the difference between morality and miracle play?
A morality play was that the actors were like specific virtues, while the miracle plays involved actual individuals, right? So Saint Justin or Saint Irenaeus or something like that. Right? So the morality play is the actor is vice, some sort of vice. Other questions? Let's go ahead and we'll stop there. We still have a couple of things I want to talk about related to Christian practice. And then after we finish that, we'll move on into that kind of Renaissance period, the 1300s, 1400s, as we see this transition from the Middle Ages to the Reformation. And so that's where we'll pick up.